Hey all, welcome back to our channel. Today we are going to do chapter number 9 in our series, The Ending of Time. And I just quickly wanted to thank one of the commenters, Umar Salim. That was a perfect question. Thank you so much. The question was something along the lines of, how do you get out of thought? How do you get out of having thought or having thoughts, and how that feels like, and whether I reached that point. And I said something along the lines of, I don't think having no thoughts is the goal, but I think and that's why I'm actually talking about this comment, is I think what's really important to understand is that it's not the thought per se that's the problem, and it's not the fact that we are, as human beings, capable of processing sensory data. But I think the problem starts when we are unaware of the fact that when we do think, sort of like embedded in the process of thinking is the creation of a byproduct, which is what we would call I or me. I think when you're unaware of that being created sort of like as a byproduct, when you're thinking, you start to pay too much attention to it. You start to pay too much attention to the I or the me or the I consciousness, whatever you want to call it. And I think that's where the problem starts. And I think that's also what Krishnamurti and Bohm are trying to convey. It's just that sometimes it's hard to, there is this, on the one hand, if you have been sort of interested in these topics, and you sort of studied them for a while, you don't need that sort of clarification all the time of what means what, what term means what exactly. It's like you don't need that anymore, but then I can see how it can cause confusion, and that's why I'm trying to clarify this right off the bat, is that I don't think having thoughts is the problem, and so therefore I don't think not having any thoughts would be, sort of like the goal, but it's more like being aware or becoming aware that whatever we conceive of our I or our me is pretty much just a byproduct of the thought process. So I think that's what you should understand. And I think another point that they've been making all along throughout these last 8 chapters pretty much is that there's no way to reach that state in terms of, willpower, because the willpower still points to having an I that wants to become something, So I know it's very paradoxical, it's very hard to understand, but I think if you can just keep an open mind throughout this whole process, and if you understand that there's nothing that you have to develop, in order to get there, but it's more like you have to be open. If you're open enough, then you are able to receive what has always been there, and I think that's sort of like how it works, I guess. So and to talk about how to make that possible, that would be a whole other series of videos, which we can very well do at some point in time. But I think I'm trying to bring as little of my own thoughts into this book review as possible. I just wanted to point out, and not to toot my own horn, but there is a playlist, I think it's called The Human Condition, in which I tried to lay out the sort of like the essence of both Krishnamurti's thinking, but then also a lot of Amit Goswami's thinking, and that's he's a physicist who dealt a great deal with quantum physics, and he is, I think, pretty much conveying a similar message, or to a similar end, I should say. And so if you're interested in exploring that further, I would really advise you to go and look at the playlist, The Human Condition. So that said, let's start with chapter 9. So this chapter further explores the brain and the modes of operation of the brain, but also the physicality of the brain. And they're somewhat concerned with the topic of senility in this chapter, which, I think is probably the wrong term to use, because what they are concerned with is that they pretty much think that whenever we are in this mode of operation of, coming from this point of view of I consciousness, they feel that this has a detrimental effect on the brain itself and on the capacity of the brain itself. But then they also say this process can be reversed, and that the brain has, the actual physical structure of the brain has the possibility to sort of rejuvenate once you get out of that mode of operation, of coming from that sort of a place of I consciousness. So we can just start the discussion of this chapter with two hypotheses. And the first one is, we are only using part of our brains. That seems to be quite obvious if you've been following the last chapters. And senility is the result of using the brain in the wrong way. And that sort of wrong way of using the brain is being described as relying on routine, as the tendency to rely on routines, and as processing sensory data based on past perceptions, like knowledge that you've already gathered, and on memories of past experiences that are organized around the idea of this ego, or ego at the center of consciousness. And so what they say is that when you are in this sort of mode, being centered around an ego, you are sort of functioning in patterns that are really repetitive, that tend to be really rather repetitive and limited, and therefore the brain has a tendency to start shrinking as you progress in age, and it also has you have a tendency to then become senile. So the question naturally arises if there is some other mode of operation for the brain which would rejuvenate it, and that question is tied to another question, which is, can the brain move out of time altogether? And to answer the question, Krishnamurti wants to first explore what it means to live in time, and we will read a short excerpt for that. What does it mean to be living in time? Let's take the other side first, because then we come to the other. What does it mean to live in time? Hope, thinking and living in the past and acting from the knowledge of the past, images, illusions, prejudices, they are all an outcome of the past. All that is time, and that is producing chaos in the world. Well, suppose we say that if we are not living psychologically in time, we may still order our actions by the watch. The thing that is puzzling is if somebody says, I'm not living in time, but I must keep an appointment, you see. Of course, you can't sit here forever. So you say, I'm looking at the watch, but I am not psychologically extending how I am going to feel in the next hour when I have fulfillment of desire, etc. I am just saying that the way we are living now is in the field of time. And there we have brought all kinds of problems and suffering. Yes, but it should be made clear why this necessarily produces suffering. You are saying that if you live in the field of time, suffering is inevitable. Inevitable. Why? It is simple. Time has built the ego, the me, the image of me sustained by society, by education, which is built through millions of years. All that is the result of time, and from there I act. Yes, towards the future, psychologically, that is, towards some future state of being. Yes, which means that the center is always becoming, trying to become better, nobler, or anything else. So all that, the constant endeavor to become something psychologically, is a factor of time. Are you saying that the endeavor to become produces suffering? Obviously, it is simple. All that is divisive. It divides me from others, and so you are different from me, and when I depend on somebody and that somebody is gone, I feel lonely and miserable. All that goes on. So we are saying that any factor of division, which is the very nature of the self, must inevitably cause suffering. Are you saying that through time, the self is set up, and then the self introduces division and conflict and so on, but that if there were no psychological time, then perhaps this entire structure would collapse, and something entirely different would happen? That's it. That is what I'm saying, and therefore the brain itself has broken up. So, now that we explored what it means to live in time, we can formulate another hypothesis. And that is, the ending of suffering comes about when the self, which is built up through time, no longer exists. And let's read another excerpt to explore this further. Time and separation as individuality are basically the same structure. Of course. Although it is not obvious in the beginning. I wonder if we see that. It might be worth discussing that. Why is psychological time the same illusion, the same structure as individuality? Individuality is the sense of being a person who is located here somewhere. Located and divided. Divided from the others. He extends out to some periphery, his domain extends out to some periphery, and also he has an identity which extends over time. He wouldn't regard himself as an individual if he said, today I am one person, tomorrow I am another. So it seems that we mean by individual somebody who is in time. I think that this idea of individuality is a fallacy. Yes, but many people may find it hard to believe, to be convinced that it is a fallacy. There is a common feeling that as an individual, I have existed at least from my birth, if not before, and go on to death and perhaps later. The whole idea of being an individual is to be in time, right? Obviously. So let's just note that once the brain is able to sort of let go of this concept of ego or of me, a lot of things change. The whole concept of time changes and what it means to be in time. Death also loses some of its meaning, and the urge to find some security in a proposed afterlife might wane, as well. So we then revisit what possible material effects living in psychological time has on the brain. And for that, we will read another short excerpt. Are you saying that this psychological content is a certain structure physically in the brain, that in order for this psychological content to exist, the brain over many years has made many connections of the cells which constitute this content? Quite. And then there is a flash of insight which sees all this, and that it is not necessary. Therefore, all this begins to dissipate. And when it has dissipated, there is no content. Then whatever the brain does is something different. Let's go further. Then there is total emptiness. Well, emptiness of the content. But when you say total emptiness, you mean emptiness of all this inward content. That's right. And that emptiness has tremendous energy. It is energy. So you could say that the brain, having had all these connections tangled, has locked up a lot of energy. That is right. Wastage of energy. And when they begin to dissipate, that energy is there. Yes. I mean, if you take the analogy of modes of operation, and I'm not that big of a, I don't know anything or much about technology. Well, I shouldn't say that, but I don't know what a good analogy would be. But it seems to make sense that when you have a system, if we sort of try to formulate it as objectively as possible. So if you have a system, that is running, that is basically in theory capable of running, in two separate modes, it would make sense that, as long as, and they're sort of mutually exclusive modes. So it would make sense that as long as the system is running in one kind of mode, and preoccupied with that sort of mode of operation, that the other one can't kick in. And I think that's the clue. Is like the clue is that, upholding this sort of, we can call it illusion really, upholding this illusion of a separately existing I or me keeps you in one sort of mode of operation. And the minute you are, or the instant I should say, you're able to let go of that illusion, and then the other mode of operation can start to kick in. And it also makes sense if you look at it that way, that once you are in this other mode of operation, and it's much better to be in that other mode of operation because it's much less painful, less suffering, from an egotistical kind of perspective. But then also it's much more rewarding because it's not so limited, and it's full of creativity and energy and all that, and it's really expansive. You wouldn't want to go back to the other mode, really. I mean, it's just you'd be an idiot if you wanted to go back to that sort of limited state of being. And I find it curious, and I think it's a good thing that they come to discuss, the method of meditation, because I think in the Western world it's been greatly, ever since it's become a thing to meditate in the Western world, I think the West has managed to also turn that into some sort of performance goal, and I think that's exactly what it's not intended to do at all. So to put it really simply, if you sit down and you are sort of motivated by, well, I have to meditate at least 1 hour a day, in order to become a better person, then you might as well just binge on Netflix, really, because the only thing you're doing when you're meditating in that sort of state of mind is you're actually reinforcing your sense of I-ness and me-ness, and you're probably making it worse, because where before you just had a regular me or a regular I, after all this, effort of meditating and making yourself a better person, you then have this sort of like spiritualized version of I and me, and you think even more highly of yourself. So tends to do the opposite, So what they're saying is that insight has to come first in order for there to be real meditation, and I think this has been observed by people who we suspect to having been enlightened with insight, and who we suspect of having been able to let go of the illusion of I or me or ego. I think what they report is that life itself becomes the meditation, and I think what that is trying to convey is that meditation no longer is regarded as a method or a vehicle to reach some sort of state, but it is that state that you have tried to reach before, before you had insight. So and there's no easy answer to, and I think there is none, actually, because if anyone asks, well, how do I get there, I think the right answer would be, that's the wrong question to ask. So I just hope that you'll be able to get something out of this, this book review, and if you can, please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.